Welcome to the debate. I want to start by looking back to 1970. Back then, almost 60% of United States households were, comfortably middle class.
Right, a solid majority.
Exactly. But today, we have watched that number structurally collapse down to just 47%.
It's a really staggering drop.
It is. And while the middle of the economy is just hollowing out, the top 0.1% of earners are pulling in nearly $7 million on average every single year. So when we evaluate the ethical responsibilities of a modern corporation today, we have to confront those numbers.
We absolutely do.
The core question of this discussion is how do businesses best fulfill their obligation to recognize and respect the rights of all? From my perspective, true respect for workers has to begin with economic parity. The fundamental ethical mandate for businesses is addressing structural economic inequality.
Right, the financial foundation.
Yeah, because if we aren't talking about living wages and pay equity legislation, all the corporate culture initiatives in the world are just window dressing on a sinking financial foundation.
Well, I come at it from a slightly different way. You can mandate equal pay across the board, but if the doors of the executive boardroom are fundamentally locked to anyone who doesn't look like the traditional 20th century CEO, your financial parity is essentially meaningless.
Meaningless? That's a strong word.
But it's true. I'd argue the core ethical mandate is fostering deep operational inclusion. We are looking at a business landscape where true respect actually begins with internal corporate culture. It's about accommodating diversity and fundamentally redesigning the workplace to navigate massive demographic shifts.
And this right here is the central tension we are unpacking today, the friction between economic equity and inclusive culture in 21st century business ethics, drawn straight from our source material.
Yeah, it's a huge debate.
So let's look closely at the stark economic realities driving my position. We are dealing with an astonishing wealth gap. We've got stagnant median net worth for lower and middle-income families, and this has persisted for decades.
Decades. Yeah.
And look at the federal minimum wage. It's been sitting at $7.25 an hour for over a decade. That is a floor that many states just, default to.
Right.
Alongside that, we still have a persistent gender pay gap. Women are still making approximately 80 cents on the dollar compared to men. To me, talking about business ethics is just a completely hollow exercise if we do not first address these foundational economic inequities through structural, legislative mechanisms. You cannot claim to be an ethical corporation while paying poverty wages.
I hear that, but pouring that economic concrete doesn't matter much if the workplace culture fundamentally excludes people from even getting through the door in the first place.
How so?
Well, let's look at the demographic realities shaping the future of work. The workforce is transforming rapidly, right? The white majority workforce, which stood at 81% in 2010, is projected to drop to 75% by 2050.
Oh, wow.
Right. And meanwhile, the Hispanic workforce is projected to double, reaching 30%.
The demographics are certainly shifting, I'll give you that. But how does acknowledging that substitute for, actually paying people fairly?
Oh, it isn't a substitute. It is the environment in which payment actually happens. And this brings us to the diversity dividend, which the material talks about at length.
Right, the financial benefits of diversity.
Exactly. The documented financial and performance benefits of a diverse workforce. This isn't just about feeling good. When a company genuinely embraces diversity, they unlock a deeply functional advantage because a homogeneous team suffers from groupthink.
They miss things.
They absolutely do. They miss market opportunities, they have blind spots. A diverse team brings a wider array of problem-solving frameworks. They generate positive customer experiences because their internal makeup actually reflects the external market they serve.
Which leads to better performance.
Right. Ethical business today requires committed managers actively making reasonable accommodations for different abilities, for different faiths, and for a multitude of backgrounds. That requires an inclusive culture, which goes far beyond just handing someone a paycheck.
Look, I am not denying that cognitive diversity yields better problem solving. But let's look at the actual mechanisms of cultural solutions versus financial ones. You mentioned the diversity dividend.
Yeah.
How do you actually achieve a diverse, thriving workforce without structural economic equity as the baseline?
We know from the macroeconomic data that raising the minimum wage helps address income inequality in very functional, structural ways.
In theory, perhaps. But raising the minimum wage is often a blunt instrument.
It is a precise economic mechanism, actually.
Is it though?
It is. Now look, if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, wait, doesn't a higher minimum wage just kill jobs or cause inflation? But the data shows it works through two distinct positive mechanisms.
Okay, lay them out.
First, it provides direct, immediate help to those who are part of a two-earner family at the lower end of the middle class. It gives them actual capital to spend on basic necessities, which, cycles right back into the local economy.
Fair enough.
Second, and this is crucial, it triggers wage compression. It positively affects higher-paid workers whose wages are implicitly tied to the minimum wage.
The ripple effect.
Exactly. When you raise the floor to $15, the worker who was previously making $16 experiences upward pressure on their wages as well. Industrialized economies function best when income inequality is minimized. If a business wants to be ethical, it needs to advocate for and implement higher wage floors. That is a measurable structural solution.
Okay, but let's test that structural solution against real-world tech industry data. Because we have glaring examples proving that money, scale, and high wages do not automatically create equity.
You're thinking of Silicon Valley.
I am. Look at the data provided on Google's workforce, specifically around their 2017 diversity report. Google operates in a highly profitable industry. They pay exceptionally well.
They certainly do.
They have virtually unlimited resources to throw at structural economic benefits and high baseline salaries. And what does the data show? Their overall workforce is 69% men.
Yikes.
And when you look at the technical roles, the high-paying, career-making jobs, women hold less than 20% of them. And their leadership at the time? 75% male.
Which points to a pipeline issue in STEM, not necessarily a failure of economic baselines.
No, I'd argue it points to a failure of culture. This is a perfect illustration of my point. Google proves that when you try to buy culture with high salaries, you often just amplify the existing biases of the people holding the checkbook.
I'm not sure it's just about buying culture, but you can have all the economic baselines and high salaries in the world, and it doesn't solve structural exclusion. That requires deliberate operational inclusion initiatives. Managers must be prepared to fully recognize blind spots and make appropriate accommodations. High pay doesn't fix a culture that subtly pushes women out of technical roles.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. We need to move beyond static ways of thinking about this. View corporate ethics like building a house.
Okay, a house, right. Economic fairness, like a livable minimum wage and equal pay legislation, is the structural foundation. While inclusion initiatives, the diversity training, the cultural stuff you're talking about, that is the interior layout.
I see where you're going with this.
Right. You cannot reasonably accommodate someone's differences if they are systematically locked out of the middle class to begin with. Women making 80 cents on the dollar isn't just a cultural flaw. It's a foundational economic failure. It requires structural, legislative solutions, not just better corporate diversity training.
But relying on legislation to pour your foundation assumes the lawmakers actually know how to mix the concrete.
Well, sure.
Historically, federal laws attempting to address the gender pay gap, like the Equal Pay Act, have consistently fallen short due to loopholes and a reliance on salary history. You are putting your faith in a legislative mechanism that has demonstrably failed to eradicate the problem.
Which is exactly why we are seeing a necessary and aggressive trend of taking legislative action at the state level. Because federal equal pay laws haven't completely closed the gap, states like California and New York are having to step up.
With stricter mandates.
Yes, like salary transparency laws that force companies to post pay ranges and job listings. This proves my exact point. Relying on businesses to just voluntarily do the right thing, culturally or ethically, it fails because of the profit motive.
Not always?
Almost always. Without state mandates forcing their hand, businesses will naturally default to whatever is most cost-effective, which usually means paying marginalized workers less. We need legislative action to force ethical compliance.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. If we look at how businesses handle unprotected classes, we see a completely different reality.
one driven by voluntary ethical leadership, not state mandates.
Unprotected classes? Like what?
Let's look at the landscape of sexual orientation discrimination. In the United States, we have a massive patchwork of legal protections. In many states, there are no statewide laws prohibiting sexual orientation discrimination in private workplaces.
That is sadly true.
Right. So by your logic, where businesses only do the right thing when forced by a state mandate, businesses in those states should be actively discriminating or at least doing the bare minimum.
Well, they certainly have the legal cover to do so.
And yet, they don't, because LGBTQ issues present a unique opportunity for ethical leadership, and companies are proactively taking it. Look at the Corporate Equality Index, or CEI.
The one administered by the Human Rights Campaign?
Exactly. This index measures very concrete steps a company takes, offering equal healthcare benefits to same-sex spouses, implementing strict anti-harassment metrics, enforcing non-discrimination policies.
Sure.
Many companies actively choose to achieve a perfect score of 100 on the CEI, even when their local state law mandates absolutely none of it. Look at the data from the material. Maryland has 67% of its major companies scoring a perfect 100 on the Corporate Equality Index.
Wow, 67%.
Yeah. Massachusetts is at 65%. These companies aren't waiting for a state mandate to build an inclusive culture. They are voluntarily preventing the denial of opportunities and creating safe environments because the culture demands it. This proves that internal corporate ethics often lead the way where legislation actually lags behind.
Okay, but you are treating the Corporate Equality Index as if it exists in a vacuum of pure corporate benevolence.
Not pure benevolence, but leadership.
Companies score highly on those indexes precisely because of immense public pressure, consumer demands, and the looming threat of wider regulation. I mean, a high CEI score is often a PR shield against consumer boycotts.
That's a bit cynical, don't you think?
It's realistic. The profit motive is still driving the behavior. It has just been weaponized by public opinion. But let's follow this thread of voluntary leadership because it brings us to a crucial pivot in the material. We've talked about human workers, demographic shifts, and wages, but the concept of recognizing and respecting the rights of all is expanding to its ultimate test.
Right. Non-human stakeholders.
Exactly.
The implications for animal rights in business. This is where the evolution of corporate ethics becomes truly fascinating. We are seeing profound questions about the treatment of animals arise across several major industries: agriculture, medicine, cosmetics.
Right, and it forces us to ask if businesses will protect stakeholders who cannot advocate for themselves, who cannot unionize, and who cannot boycott.
And this sector perfectly illustrates my point about a cultural shift toward inclusion driving real change.
How so?
Because to achieve sustainability in something like the world's food supply chain or safety in medical testing, all stakeholders must work in concert. That means the political sector, the business sector, finance, academia, the consumer.
It's a massive web.
It is. It requires a holistic, cultural, cost-benefit analysis. And look at how businesses are voluntarily innovating to find alternatives to animal testing.
You are referring to the technological alternatives, which I admit are impressive, but they are incredibly capital intensive.
They are, but companies invest in them because true ethical inclusion means innovating away from cruelty. We are seeing incredible advancements that fundamentally change the paradigm. Businesses are utilizing patient drug databases and virtual drug trials driven by complex computer models.
Right.
But look at the biological innovations, too. We're seeing the rise of microdosing in phase 0 clinical trials.
That's where they bypass the animal entirely, right?
Exactly. And the mechanism here is brilliant. By administering a sub-pharmacological dose, maybe 1/100th of a normal dose, to a human volunteer, it doesn't trigger a therapeutic effect or toxicity.
It's perfectly safe.
Right. But using accelerator mass spectrometry, researchers can track exactly how the human metabolism processes the drug. We aren't just replacing animals. We are actually getting more accurate data because we are bypassing the biological differences between a mouse and a human.
And the in vitro stuff, too.
Yes. We are seeing in vitro methods based on human cell and tissue cultures. Businesses are adopting these technologies not just because they are forced to by a regulator, but because a deeper ethical culture is taking root.
Operating alongside the desire for better data is a genuine desire to recognize animal rights. It is a cultural shift in how we view non-human entities.
I won't deny that microdosing and virtual trials are massive leaps forward in how we gather data. But I have to bring this right back to my core thesis here. Regulation and structural rules are what actually establish the ethical baseline that forces that innovation to happen.
You think regulation forced microdosing?
I think you framed the reduction in animal testing as a voluntary, culturally driven awakening. But look closely at the realities of laboratory animals. We have federal laws, like the Animal Welfare Act. The explicit goal of these existing laws is not necessarily to ban tests altogether, which honestly speaks to the limits of our current cultural awakening, but rather to establish strict standards for humane treatment and housing.
Standards which are often criticized as woefully inadequate.
But they are a baseline. The law mandates specific requirements for veterinary care, sanitation, and the humane housing of animals in laboratories. It dictates the exact physical dimensions of the cage a primate is kept in.
A cage is still a cage.
True, but it is the systemic rules that force laboratories to provide a baseline of humane housing. If we relied purely on the goodwill and cultural inclusion of the cosmetics or medical industries, history shows us those standards would plummet back to whatever maximizes profit. Systematic rules, legislation, and structural baselines force ethical behavior.
I see what you're saying. But
Just as minimum wage laws force a baseline of economic equity for human workers, humane housing laws force a baseline of ethical treatment for non-human subjects.
a law that merely dictates the size of a cage is exactly the kind of uninspired baseline compliance I am arguing against. If a business is just following a legal mandate about cage dimensions, they aren't truly acting ethically. They are just checking a compliance box to avoid fines.
It's better than nothing.
But the companies investing millions in developing in vitro human cell cultures and virtual drug trials, they are driven by a deeper ethical culture that seeks to eliminate the cage entirely. That is the fundamental difference between a structural mandate and true proactive inclusion. Compliance keeps the cage clean, culture dismantles the cage.
But without the mandate defining the baseline size and sanitation of that cage today, the cage just gets smaller tomorrow. You need the structural floor before you can build the cultural ceiling.
And I maintain that if you only obsess over the floor, you end up with a fundamentally flawed system, one where massive tech corporations can pay exorbitant salaries but still systematically exclude minorities and women from ever reaching the ceiling.
Which brings us to a clear crystallization of our two perspectives today. As we analyze the trajectory of 21st century business ethics, my stance remains that structural economic equity is the absolute non-negotiable baseline.
Right.
Whether we are talking about raising the minimum wage to functionally support two-earner families, implementing aggressive state-level salary transparency laws to finally close that 20% gender pay gap, or utilizing strict regulatory standards to enforce the humane treatment of laboratory animals, ethics requires a structural legal foundation. You cannot have a truly ethical business without first ensuring economic parity and strict legal compliance.
And my position remains that a structural baseline is woefully inadequate on its own. The true drivers of ethical progress are internal culture, proactive inclusion, and a willingness to embrace the diversity dividend.
The ceiling, as you put it.
Exactly. As we see with the shifting demographics of the workforce and the persistent cultural disparities in highly paid industries like tech, businesses must go far beyond just paying a minimum wage. They must redesign their internal environments to make reasonable accommodations for different faiths and abilities, and they must demonstrate voluntary ethical leadership, like we see with the proactive adoption of the Corporate Equality Index and the rapid development of non-animal testing alternatives, even when the law doesn't strictly force their hand.
Well, despite the friction between our frameworks, I think we can both acknowledge a shared reality that emerges clearly from this discussion.
Absolutely.
The landscape of business ethics has fundamentally evolved. It requires moving far beyond the simplistic 20th century model of mere shareholder profit generation. To survive and operate ethically today, a business must actively engage in recognizing and respecting the rights of a vast array of stakeholders.
From marginalized human workers needing proactive accommodations and equal pay, all the way to non-human animals entangled in our agricultural supply chains and medical research, the ethical circle is undeniably expanding, and businesses have to expand with it.
It is an incredibly complex balancing act, weighing macroeconomic policy and legislative mandates against the creation of an inclusive, forward-thinking corporate culture. And there is so much more depth to explore in the source material regarding how different specific industries, from tech to pharmaceuticals, handle these exact ethical crossroads.
Truly, the challenges of navigating demographic diversity, mitigating income inequality, and defining stakeholder rights are not going away. They are the defining operational challenges of this century.
So, as we wrap up this discussion, think back to the house analogy we discussed earlier. The next time you evaluate a company's ethics, ask yourself, are you just admiring the beautiful, inclusive design of their interior layout, or are you checking the economic integrity of the foundation beneath it? Because to build an ethical framework that actually lasts, you ultimately have to account for both.